I mentioned the idea of a historical moment in the last slide. And what I mean by that is there's something different in the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s that brings to light a lot of the problems with imperialism and especially a lot of the contradictions inherent in it. So if we think about this, Europeans claim to have these ideals that came from the Enlightenment and from experiments with democracy, right? So ideas that all men are created equal from the numerous declarations that we looked at, that everybody has their own rights, that if a government is oppressive, people have the right and perhaps even the obligation to overthrow it. The notion that democracy is good, but how does democracy play out in empires? None of that seems to justify all of the approaches that Europeans took in largely Africa and Asia, but also South America as well. There's also a new international climate after World War II. The war had weakened Britain. It had weakened France. It had weakened a country that we haven't talked about a lot, Holland or the Netherlands. It had weakened the United States. And that creates kind of a new forum, a new conversation that can be developed arguing for the anti-colonial cause. Especially this happens as the United Nations, I didn't mention this in our World War II lecture, but kind of the heir of the League of Nations is developed, and these conversations can happen with representatives of different areas. A lot of colonizers began to prepare to get rid of or to divest themselves of colonies, but also to look ahead and set themselves up for favorable relationships with those former colonies, especially when it comes to using them to protect economic interests that had been developed during the imperial era. Also, at the same time, we see a lot of elite people challenging the idea of colonial rule. So if we think about, let's just do India again as an example. You've had generations of Brits in India who had introduced Western styles of education and Western styles of military service and had trained Indians there in those approaches to education and military. So if that's the case, then over generations, they had trained people in European manners, in European ideas and ideals, and several of those individuals become very charismatic leaders. They raise up in colonial settings. And in lots of these cases, different types of volunteers join the ranks of freedom fighters to end foreign or white, in the case of South Africa, domination. So again, lots of things changing post-World War II. New conversations happening, weakening of powers, the rise of people who are able to have conversations using Western-style logic to support their arguments for decolonization.